unfortunately, it was wound up being too focused on the developer community and not focused enough on the end users.
Digesting that one.
Yeah, it's real simple.
It's interesting you say that, because I'm just trying to like dial my head back to 2010, 11, 12. So there was, there was Piston, Nebula, Mirantis, Cloud Scaling, and then, I wouldn't even say like Cisco and HP and all those guys were in yet. It was like, no, yeah. And yeah, it was very, I don't want to sound like I'm insulting anyone, but it felt very much of like a fun, like, Python, like, teenage project, and developers were building this. I didn't get the sense that they were impedance matching their customers. Maybe that's where you're going, but maybe yeah. But there was like a sincerity to what they were doing, right? But yeah,
there was a lot of optimism.
It was a lack of leadership, basically, is what I'm getting at. Yeah.
I don't know. It was a lack of product market fit to a certain degree.
Product market fit.
But also to a certain degree, it was, that the customers themselves were bad actors in a lot of this. We came in, time after time after time with this vision of like, hey, you want to, have this AWS compatible OpenStack. You want to have less choices. You don't want to have like, you don't want to build a snowflake basically. And customers all wanted to build a snowflake. It was like, oh, we can't do that. We're an EMC shop, so we need support for EMC storage. Oh no, we can't do that. We're a Dell shop. We need support for Dell storage. We need support for NetApp storage. We need support for. So what wound up happening is like, we could only close customers that would buy into this vision of building, kind of like the hyperscalers. That's all cloud scaling could do. So it was like AT&T and Walmart, because those guys got it. And Lithium, which is a smaller customer, and they loved our product. They thought it was great. But then, others like Nebula and, Piston had a bit more of an opinionated stack like we did. But, the Nebula guys, were trying to like support everybody's, widget. And then Mirantis would assemble whatever the heck you wanted. And it just happened time after time. You get this OpenStack deployment, it was custom bespoke because, it was built, using professional services, or it was just hand built by the customer, and they couldn't scale it. They couldn't operate it. Eventually fell over. Expedia was the most extreme example. They had a big deployment in there, and they were determined to use Ceph, and they were using like Neutron, and they couldn't stabilize any of it. So eventually that team got fired, and Expedia was like, okay, we're going to Amazon. And this just happened a lot. OpenStack needed to be productized. It never got productized, really. It continued to be a science experiment. And this whole thing in the early days, where there was like this certain kind of enthusiasm and optimism, which was great, and it helped kind of get the community going, engaged, it morphed into hubris, right? And so you'd have people like building components that just they didn't make any damn sense, like Keystone, like the world needs another authentication system that's not compatible with any of the existing authentications. Oh, and it must be written in Python. Why can't you just use one of the other existing authentication systems? There's no reason. Kerberos, bulletproof, scalable, secure. Microsoft AD is based off of it, Active Directory, right? And they couldn't use, LDAP plus Kerberos. It's ridiculous, right? It could do everything that they wanted to do, but no, somebody had to write it. And the person who wrote it didn't know anything about authentication systems or service directories or anything. They just freaking made shit up from scratch. And then they did it again on Barbican. The guy who, wrote Barbican doesn't have a security background or never written a key management system before. And it was like this certain amount of hubris where it was like, okay to reinvent the wheel on everything in OpenStack. And then at the same time to sort of be like anti-bringing anything else that wasn't OpenStack into the OpenStack community and like integrating with it. Like, if you want to be here in OpenStack, you need to do it in OpenStack. So You know, that optimism morphing into hubris was just a key problem. And, you know, and I would say there were a number of bad actors who were leaders, development leaders, whose focus was not on what customers ultimately needed, but on what developers needed. So there was almost this crazy pendulum shift all the way over to like, you know, whatever's going to make the developers happy and we get more developers in the door, as opposed to what's going to make the greatest product. And taking our eye off the ball on what's going to make the greatest product was wrong. It was ultimately wrong. And some people would say that OpenStack is a success, and I say there is no way. You cannot look at it and say it's a success, right? Kubernetes is a success. VMware is a success. Many things are successes, but successes means that you've got mass market adoption. OpenStack has never achieved that. Yes, it's in running in certain places like CERN.
It
That's
should have been the
nice.
Linux of cloud. It should have been the Linux of cloud.
Correct.
And it
Correct.
didn't. And it missed, I don't
Nope.
know if it missed a Linus, if it missed a singular, you know,
That was
leader.
my point. That was my point in presentation that I did. It missed a Linus, or if not a Linus, at least a group of people acting as a Linus who were making hard
But
decisions.
there was a group of project technical PTLs. There was you know, you were on the leadership committee, the board, whatever you called it.
I was on the board, yeah.
What were those board meetings? What were those board meetings like when you gathered? What was talked about?
Dude, here's the fundamental problem, right? There was this artificial line that was written into the bylaws that basically said all the technical concerns are the concerns of the TSC, which was the PTLs and the rest of the technical leaders, and all of the business, you know, concerns, marketing, all that are the board's concerns. And it was literally written into the bylaws, and this caused this problem because there's lots of this shit where,
So if
like,
you're technical on the board, then you really don't have a voice in a way. Yeah.
well, you did when you were on the board. You had a voice on all the business side, but there
in
were
the business,
there were no right. There were no board members sitting on the TSC, and you couldn't get on the TSC unless you were technical and doing code contributions. So it was very the structure was set up so that the PTLs and the technical leaders had an undue amount of influence over the overall project. I brought this shit up multiple times in the board. I presented on it at different venues, and basically my point was like, the problem is that there are decisions that you think are technical that are actually not technical, or at least not solely technical. Like the decision that like everything has to be written in Python, right? That there are business decisions about what, you know, a business decision should be able to be like, any language is appropriate to use for the product we're building. Like, people want to think that that's a technical decision, and it is sometimes, but it's not always. And there were many of these things where there was a gray area. And what happened is, if it was even mildly technical, the people in the TSC basically said, that's technical, that's ours, you don't get to have any say in it. So the board got boxed out of any sort of technical decisions, even when there was clear that there was a sort of a business aspect to them. And ultimately that was bad, because the technical leadership, you know, had this bias towards enabling more and more developers and, you know, rewarding from a community perspective, you know, the rewriting or recreation of the wheel at the drop of a hat. And, you know, and they basically could do whatever they want on the technical side, even if it had a business impact. And so it was, they shot themselves in the foot that way. There should have been more, you know, when you get, sorry to go on this rant, but like, you know, when you're building like a really good team, you know, you need people with very different perspectives to come in and help you, right? Different cultural backgrounds, different, you know, genders and gender identities, different, you know, ways that they grew up, because everybody's kind of got different learning. And then when you've got enough kind of different perspectives around the table, you can kind of triangulate where to go. And what happened there is that we got too much of groupthink out of the technical folks, and they were like, talk to the hand to people on the board who had done things kind of in these realms before, who were infrastructure people and business people, but like, you know, had enough technical backgrounds like myself to like be able to give really good feedback on what needed to happen. And we were just basically not allowed to be part of the conversation. And when I brought this shit up at the board meetings, I effectively got shouted down. And, there were people, and I'm not going to name names, who I still to this day, I don't respect them because their egos got in the way of what could have been a much more successful project.
Yeah, and one a great example is, so when it started, like the compute project, like Nova, and then Swift, object storage, and APIs were kind of compatible to the way AWS is architecting its APIs, because
Right.
arguably APIs is what OpenStack is. It's a currency of communicating with OpenStack. And so the moment OpenStack decided to try to like do native APIs that were more proprietary, if you will, to OpenStack and not playing well with AWS, which was pretty much, even in 2013, it was like the winner. 12, even 10, it was the winner. Like, let's play there, guys. We're trying to do hybrid cloud, and then here you come with like your own APIs, and then you wrote a very famous post. I remember reading it in 2012 or 13, and it was very opinionated, and it was like, guys, so what did you say in that post?
I basically said that the AWS APIs were the de facto standard, and that, we would be better off, implementing a version of them so that somebody who was, talking to OpenStack, with the AWS APIs could use the same tooling, the same, infrastructure to basically talk to either OpenStack or AWS, which made us, the de facto hybrid option for building private cloud and then hybridizing it to AWS. And that ultimately, that's how we would win, was be partnering with and riding on Amazon's success rather than trying to treat them as an enemy.
So I want to get into more of an organizational dynamic here. So the OpenStack at the time was very tribal. It was like you were you were part of this little gang, and then here you are kind of like getting out of that and saying, no, guys, wait. Did you receive backlash? How hard was it for you to do? What was behind that? And then what were the after effects of that blog post that was very disruptive to this tribal element?
I mean, there was tons of backlash, but it all came from kind of like the developer leadership community that I talked to, the one that sort of like was doing a lot of navel gazing, and their perspective was like, basically, if they tried to copy the AWS APIs, that they would always be following them, and that AWS would control everything, and so on and so on. And it was really weird because there was this sort of like deliberate kind of like intent to like basically try to demolish my my perspectives. Like some of these technical people get up meetings and they would say nobody uses the EC2 APIs, and I'd look at the user survey. I'm like, here's the user survey from this year, last year, the year before, and right there, 35% of the people are using of the people who use OpenStack are using the EC2 APIs. 35%, not nobody, 1/3. That is a substantial portion of basically the user community, and so it was just really challenging because it wasn't.
AWS is painted as evil. I remember by OpenStack, right? It was like
totally.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that was a mistake.
they're the enemy.
That was a mistake.
We're gonna kill them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was a mistake.
Yeah, it was a mistake. And I see this happen still with a lot of startups. They like look at it and they're like, oh, Amazon's gonna co-opt my, what I'm doing. And it's like, you should be trying to figure out how to ride the Amazon wave. You shouldn't be trying to figure out how to compete against them because it's a mistake. It's like trying to compete against Microsoft in, the late 80s or early 90s. It's just, that's silly, right? But, one of the fundamental problems was that, there was just this idea that OpenStack would magically be soaked up by the masses, just like Linux was. And
I drank that Kool-Aid. I thought it was going to happen. Yeah.
Well, me too. In the very early days, but I pivoted over pretty quickly when I saw that our execution, was garbage, and that without kind of like a a Linux behind it without some kind of like, some kind of like intent, some kind of architectural decision making that it was going to turn into a shitstorm. I didn't understand, many of these technical leaders would be like, well, we can just support another storage platform. I'll just make a plugin framework and then anybody can plug it. And I was like, and I'm even presenting about it. Nobody's paying any attention to me. I'm like, you can create a plugin framework and you can stick in 20 different storage systems. But if you think that just because you got a plug in there, that all 20 storage systems are gonna like act the same, you're crazy. Because what's going to happen is like every single storage system is going to have their own little special thing that they want the storage APIs to do or represent, that's some feature that for them is differentiated. When you use a network plugin like in Microsoft Windows to like support different NICs, right? Microsoft is acting as the arbiter who says like what the NICs have to do, what the plugins can do, what the APIs can do. And so it's very difficult for you to like have some special thing because none of the other NICs have it. I'm not saying that it's impossible, but there's this arbiter that makes a decision. Nobody wanted to be the arbiter in OpenStack. It's like, why do we have to do that? It'll just kind of, it'll come together. And I just didn't get it.
Actually, I'd argue, I think there were people that wanted to be the arbiter, but there was too many people that were conflicting and then they weren't agreeing to see how to come together. I think there was too many egos or personalities that were thinking that they were the founders. I remember it being an argument. I'm a co-founder. No, I'm a co-founder. No, I'm the founder. And there's a lot of that going on too, which is.
I agree with that. Yeah, I mean, you could even say that I, to a certain degree, was responsible for some of that by advocating that, that OpenStack focus on the AWS compatibility. But, at least that was a direction that had kind of teeth, right? But to kind of what we were talking about earlier, like a lot of customers didn't even really want that. It was like frustrating because.
So along this time though, Randy, like, so there was no alternative really in the private cloud space. I remember Nutanix was storage, VMware's vCloud, so vSphere was there, obviously the cash cow. They came out with vCloud and it was very telco focused. It was very telco service provider focused. And there was VCE, like the VMware, alliance with EMC and Cisco. I can't think of any other proprietary, but then VMware is one. VMware is basically, kind of private cloudy, they're and then, maybe there's some other fringe players.
I would say Kubernetes one is what I would. One, because it was an opinionated approach as opposed to an approach where everybody can do anything they want in the ecosystem. So OpenStack would have had a chance to be successful if they had gone with an opinion approach, even if it wasn't the one I advocated. But no, let's be all things to all people and support all different networking, storage, everything. Oh, support everything except for AWS APIs because they're evil and they're the enemy.
Go figure.